So thank you all for joining. The trajectory of education and career progress for researchers is always a long one, and especially when, as it has with Saurabh, the PhD comes not only after primary and secondary and tertiary education, but also some time in the field and a master's degree. And so it's, you know, it's always an important moment in people's lives when they arrive at the dissertation defense. And it's also an important moment for the institution as well. This is as President Crow likes to say at graduation every year, this is the highest award for academic achievement that the university gives. And so it is a special time to come together, both to celebrate the work that in this case, Saurabh Biswas has done over the last 5 years as a PhD student, but also to celebrate the community of research and scholarship that he has helped build among students and his fellow students, among faculty, drawing together researchers who do not always or normally work together to form new bonds around new projects. So we really appreciate Saurabh's having been part of ASU for the last 5 years and pursuing this work. And we're very much looking forward to hearing the summation of that project here today. The order of business for today is that Saurabh will take roughly a half an hour, maybe a little bit longer, to present his dissertation research to us, at which time we will have an open session for questions and answers, usually questions from the audience and answers from Saurabh, but not always, and other options are allowable. But we'll have a Q&A period, and that Q&A period will last for another half an hour or so, bringing us to approximately 5 o'clock local time here in Arizona. And at that time, Saurabh and the committee will move into executive session and thank the rest of you for joining us, but ask you to leave, and then we will have the remaining time as the committee to discuss the results with Saurabh and to work with him to identify final revisions for this project before we do our final sign-off on it. So with that, let me ask Arnhem or Marco if they have any additional thoughts that they would like to share at this point, and then we will turn it over to Saurabh.
No additional issues, no.
Okay.
No comments from my end. Just good luck to Saurabh.
Great. So Saurabh, take it away. The floor is yours. And everyone, please, I see most of you have done so, but please mute your microphones while Saurabh is talking so we can all hear the best as possible. Thanks.
Thank you, Clark, Arnhem, and Marco. Thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening and morning if you're further east. Thank you for tuning in to my dissertation talk today. I am delighted to talk to you about my research on creating social value of energy at the grassroots, investigating the energy poverty nexus and co-producing solutions for energy thriving. Over the next 30 minutes or so, I will take you through the motivation and background that has inspired my research and distills my research objectives, the three thematic investigation areas that explore patterns in the interlinked domains of energy, poverty, and interventions. And then I'll summarize the findings in each and conclude with key takeaways. And of course, we'll have time for question and answers at the end. Pardon me. So this picture in the background from 2012 is a good place to start this discussion today. As I worked on off-grid energy systems with communities in some of the remotest parts of India, the significance of human aspect in the energy system became very obvious, which is often ignored by engineers and planners. In this picture, I'm trying to explain benefits of a off-grid biomass electricity system and its advantages over an unreliable grid supply. But the community members are concerned if this would generate work for them, or will it help them continue protecting their sacred forests through traditional biomass gathering harvesting practices. The reason they have in the past witnessed development projects taking away more in exchange for marginal gains. More recently though, with the advent of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, such synergies and trade-offs are getting increased attention, as the figure on your screen shows. And as is the research on human and social dimensions of energy transitions. The improvements in health and sanitation indicators in Gorkha district of Nepal established one such linkage, where the entire town water supply system was rebuilt after the 2015 earthquake and is now powered by its own solar power supply. However, the question now is, with the exception of a few cases like Gorkha, is energy research and practice undertaking deliberate structural shifts in response to the articulation of a global vision of sustainable development? Are existing paradigms capable of integrating this aspirational purpose? Recent data suggests otherwise, and it suggests that there is a mismatch. Energy system decisions appear to be out of step with the sustainable development agenda. Missed targets, underinvestment, and poverty enhancing energy solutions tell a different story. Further understanding of this mismatch would require revisiting the paradigm driving the universal access narrative of energy transitions. The concept of energy poverty has been the driving force for more than at least a decade of energy and development research. It is a consumption-oriented and appliance-centered worldview of the energy-human development relationship. Although very appealing in its simplicity and quantifiability, it offers no insight on how energy services or devices translate to outcomes that address the poverty or human development challenge, which is a multidimensional and complex phenomenon in itself. Therefore, all current measures of energy poverty are indirect measures. Indirect approaches isolate pieces of inherently multiplex phenomena, try to establish near causalities, and thus lose sight of the bigger problem. Energy poverty suffers from the same analytical challenge as does income poverty in poverty studies. Both are problem-centric, deficit tracking approaches geared to draw linear and deterministic causal relationships. As a result, such approaches exclude the principal actor for whom all this research is supposedly taking place, the people. Thus, a mismatch exists in the way knowledge is constructed about the energy and poverty or energy and sustainable development phenomena. It should be noted here that poverty alleviation or achieving human development is central to the sustainable development agenda. The goal of my research is to link energy use and its translation to development outcomes for individuals, households, and communities. I investigate this through studying the energy poverty nexus, cross-linking and analyzing apparently disparate trends of the nexus and look at them from a community development perspective, converging the insights into design projects that test and validate the concepts. The three thematic areas that you see on the screen relate to this structure. Informed by a systematic literature review of energy access programs in India, Tanzania, Sri Lanka, and the Philippines, and a parallel review of the research on poverty helped me frame the nexus, which was further improved through several empirical studies. The failures in meaningfully addressing poverty and creating gains in socioeconomic development is partly driven by insufficient access, but also the erosion caused by burdensome energy systems combined with systematic underdevelopment that sustain poverty. The 4 dimensions of the energy nexus are the lack of physical access to forms of energy, the ability or inability of individuals to translate energy access to personal development outcomes, the role of the social, cultural, environmental, economic, or political system in enabling or limiting such translation capabilities, and a variety of cascade effects resulting from the interaction of all 3 dimensions. At the core of this investigation is the concept of social value of energy. It is a user-centered perspective on how energy services and systems create benefits, as you can see in the green box, limits or diminishes those benefits through burdens and trade-offs, the box in the middle, and creates long-term risks or externalities, the last one. Therefore, to investigate the energy poverty nexus hypothesis, there was the need for a methodology which is able to oscillate between multiple levels and link observed phenomena while being anchored in human development. Clearly, the existing method to study energy poverty were not sufficient. The eventual methodology resulted by converging the human development-centric concepts of social value of energy and the capabilities approach with systems-focused conceptual and methodological approaches with the socio-energy system and multi-layered networks. Social value of energy maps, the resulting methodology, presents visualization and analytical insights into the multiple dimensions of the relationship and identifies cross-scale interactions of energy and poverty. One of the test cases in the development of the social value of energy maps and finding evidence of energy poverty nexus is the study conducted at a place called Ramgarh in India. It's a mini grid serving a cluster of 6 villages, about 300 homes connected to this, powered by a mini hydro project, and is one of the rare examples of sustained standalone community managed projects, which has lasted for 30 years now. The social value of energy map was first used to create the opportunity space of the user value at Ramgarh. Here you see the different categories of capabilities in the rows, intersecting with the social value of energy classes in the columns. Next to it is the map of enabling conditions. This is the generalized form of the map, which is applied through interviews, observations, surveys, and focus group discussions, and leads to the initial framing of the energy poverty landscape. Once that has been framed, the next step is to map the socio-energy system by identifying the different actors across levels, their interactions through multiple channels, and their interpretation of the target space, which in this case is the energy poverty landscape of Ramgarh. Do note that this is a multi-perspective approach to understanding the social construction of energy poverty. This map results from the positional analysis of a variety of perspectives. The 5 different perspectives depicted here represent how a variety of actors, the users, the project operators, the funders, the state agency, perceive the connections, actions, and the interpretation of the energy poverty nexus at Ramgarh, especially given the climate change phenomenon and the direct effects on mountainous communities like this. This leads to the characterization of flows within and across the layers and cross-linked analysis of conditions and actions with relation to the energy and poverty relationship. What it does, this analysis, it enables a certain identification of phenomena. First, the first example here is a mechanism that has helped disrupt the energy poverty nexus at Ramgarh. Being an agricultural community, seasonal variability in incomes are a fact and lead to episodic payments by users. However, the structural autonomy created by the operational arrangement here lets social learning happen through embedded actors who learn from user behavior and tendencies, which leads to a penalty and reward system that smoothens the revenue variations from the project. This enables users to continue generating value from using electricity even in months when they cannot pay for it. For the project, at the end of the year, revenue loss is 0 or minimal. A review of the accounts for the previous 8 years established that payment defaults extend to 2 harvest cycles in the worst cases. The second example is of the emergent stress to the project due to shifts in rainfall pattern. It's causing a variable production in the hydropower plant, which increases the revenue pressure combined with shocks like floods that require capital injection into the project for major reconstruction. However, rebuilding the infrastructure after the latest flood event has created a missed opportunity in redesigning for changing climate and greater value creation through a water management system that runs parallel to this. It strengthens the misinformed narrative in policy circles that community projects are stopgap solutions before the grid eventually arrives. This is categorically untrue in the case of Ramgarh. The knowledge system gap in this case has created a dissonance where actors in different positions ascribe reasons of success with limited or distorted information on the dynamics in the other layers of the system. This study clearly establishes that adaptations made at the project level by the project operators to counter the effect of climate change are interpreted as operational inefficiencies at the policy level. Now, with additional experiments and data from the application of the methods to other cases, the social value of energy map has led to an analytical framework at multiple levels of the nexus. For the user, it creates insights on a variety of value creation and burdening variables. Capabilities, functional and economic, energy burden, benefits adjusted energy burden where the expense on energy causes some kind of a return, and other forms of non-economic burden or lost well-being. For energy services, its translational elasticity can be assessed. I describe translational elasticity as the degree of tolerance in the energy service arrangement to demand swings and other revenue pressures without burdening the discovery and growth of user capabilities. It is also a measure of responsiveness or rigidness in the service to the evolution of demand and changes in user capability. And finally, the drivers and pressures from the system can be identified in a variety of categories and across various levels. So it could be information flows, platforms for learning and communication, the decision-making structures, and sensitivity to the emerging challenges, especially climate risks. So, summarizing the learning from theme 1, the investigation of the energy poverty nexus and development of the social value of energy maps has helped characterize translation pathways through which energy systems interact with human and social dimensions to create value in communities. It generates a map of possibilities, accounts for temporal spread, latency, and often unquantifiable nature of social relations. In terms of the SDGs, there is now increased visibility of the interaction mechanisms. Moving on to theme 2, the role of communities is critical here in creating change for sustainability through bottom-up actions and is a key success factor. Hence, the second thematic investigation focuses on the dynamics of co-production at the grassroots. Well, I don't need to tell you that misdirected development has caused too many problems, as this cartoon here from the 1980s in India depicts. The shock on the face of the banker when a poor farmer brings his cattle as mortgage for an easy farm loan. A key reason why such gaps occur is that the linkages we discussed in theme 1 result from a lack of methods, data, and evidence on what is valuable for the beneficiaries and how they might interact with the solution. Rio Claro is a community-based collective action for sustainable transformation of the community. It aims to address current sustainability challenges and create a deliberative platform for continued action. It is anchored in the aspirations of the residents of Rio Claro to retain their rural communal fabric and identity while enhancing its environmental and economic health. I co-founded this initiative with the community of Rio Claro and a local nonprofit in 2016. The goal was to develop a bottom-up initiative for change under conditions of marginalization and uncertainty. Bottom-up initiatives have their own organizational and knowledge process challenges, largely due to their resource and capacity constrained environment. And therefore, Rio Claro is also a platform to engage in constructive deconstruction of the cultural, social, and political dimensions of sustainability challenges with the goal of creating capacities and intent for change. It sought to produce systematic knowledge on the inertia and long-term dynamics while implementing transformational sustainability solutions. What social structures and interactions influence actions? How individuals and group tendencies play their role? And what design practices can be identified to tackle diversity, scale, and uncertainty of the action situation are the questions we were asking. From a large amount of data and insights created over 2 years of study, I summarize the following 3 key result areas. From an intervention design standpoint, there are at least 6 classes of variables that intersect to create an intervention that's sustained and continues to grow. Complementary matching of capacity and program needs. Second, creating management structures that can coordinate across levels. And third, identifying new leaders are the 3 planning variables. These have to be supplemented by an engagement platform that learns from actions and needs a communication protocol for transparency. And finally, an evaluation process matched to the needs and capacities of the program. It also revealed that implementation of this design cannot be linear. Therefore, the second key learning was that a fixed theory of change fails to capture the of change. Prototype or pilot studies were used to test solutions and make changes until they were ready to be rolled out. From a theoretical development standpoint, the process of experimenting with different types of design and implementation practices resulted in the proposal of the probe, perturb, and perform concept. Systems, when pushed out of a temporary stable state, oscillate between several states, revealing the possibilities of change and the factors that would drive that change or hold it back. This is known as the edge of chaos phenomena of complex systems. So applied to the collective action situation under consideration here, it begins by probing intent, behavioral tendencies, social network dynamics, and other interactions. Then perturbing the system through experimental interventions reveals system inertias and additional action areas like capacity gaps. And then finally, learning from the results in the previous steps, solutions at scale can be implemented in the perform step. One example of probing studies is the information flow patterns in Rio Claro with respect to the injection points of a specific information. The source, retention, and interpretation characteristics that were measured, and you can see on the map with the different colors depicting the spread of information, reveal insights into the willingness and ability to participate in the collective action. The second illustration is of a full cycle implementation and is demonstrated by the solid waste management project at Rio Claro, where a series of probing studies informed the technical and social structure of the pilot interventions between 2016 and 17, revealing and leading to a prototype pilot in 2017, which in turn revealed key capacity gaps that were overlooked in earlier stages. And then finally, after adaptations and improvements, the full-scale intervention was rolled out in 2018. Summarizing key insights, it can be inferred that collective action interventions should be mindful of at least four dynamics at the grassroots. First is value construction has a different structure for a collective action and a personal action level. Second, information and influence networks underpin action, and especially translation of information intent to action in people. Capacities and leadership and the levels of organization are diverse, and any reasonable solution has to take into account that diversity. And finally, a communication and reflexive evaluation process is important to create the confidence and trust among people, and that transparency where they can associate with the program. So at the end of theme 2, the translation mechanism is further deconstructed and key forms of interventions are identified which are required to implement ideas in challenging social settings. Now, the results and methods that were investigated in the previous 2 themes has to be tested for consistency and applicability by a wide range of actors. Therefore, theme 3 was designed as a test for the hypothesis that engages multiple implementers to apply the concepts in different situations and generate data for validation. 4 grassroots enterprises collaborated for this project in Nepal, Uganda, Philippines, and Bolivia. And one of the reasons why this project was important is this, that the disengaged implementation of development concepts lead to results like the one you see in the picture from a school in a remote forest community in the Philippines. A fairly sophisticated rainwater harvesting infrastructure is creating an energy burden since the level of the faucets is higher than that of the storage tanks, which requires a generator to pump water. Interventions based on theoretical frameworks are not implemented by researchers, but are negotiated design at the confluence of actors and convergence of knowledge systems. Local change agents are uniquely placed in the socio-energy system. Thus, this project engages a variety of such actors to facilitate knowledge exchange, contextualization of design, and adaptation of design tools. The ecosystem approach is a practitioner's version of the synthesis of the findings from the earlier stages of the research. It is a 3-step methodology to systematically study the characteristics of the complex system and situate the design to leverage these insights to achieve the goal of social value creation. So beginning with creating evidence on forms of social value, it presents a structured approach for project designers to account for risks and uncertainties that exist or can emerge from the larger ecosystem. The year-long project was structured to embed the researcher with the practitioner partner for a period of 4 weeks. In those 4 weeks, it began with the classroom training where ideas were exchanged, then assessing past projects implemented by the practitioner and using the framework to evaluate those processes critically and extract learnings from that. And then finally, collaborate for a new design project in a selected area. These were achieved after the partners, and once the engagement, the embeddedness, the researcher returned from the site, there were continuous monitoring of project performance for new projects, and further learning was documented over a period of 1 year. The research objectives that underlie this project were, of course, to validate and adapt the social value of energy and energy poverty nexus hypothesis, but also to test and customize toolkits for community projects, and do this through action reflection partnership between practitioners and academia, and create collaborations. A quick summary of what we achieved in terms of numbers. There were 18 off-grid projects that were evaluated across 4 countries. There were 3 new design projects that were undertaken and are currently commissioned. In terms of enterprise process developments, we created knowledge processes that for each of our partners and monitoring and evaluation protocols for some of the partners. And we are continuing this partnership with 6 research proposals submitted and a tutorial and online resource for learning, an open source learning that is hosted on our website. Now, key insights here in this project in terms of implementation and other development interventions are this. The first is value creation is a non-linear process of discovery that is highly unstable at the beginning. Projects have to deliberately enable the discovery process to sustain value creation, and in turn the projects will sustain themselves. Otherwise, any created value decays quite fast until the threshold of remedial value is breached, and it takes down the project with it. Hence, enabling mechanisms are required to assist value discovery and add up the project to such emerging opportunities. This needs to be done until this threshold is crossed and the project reaches technological as well as economic stability. The second finding was this theory of change that we synthesized from our experiences implementing the projects. So instead of beginning with installing a piece of technology and then figuring out how it works, we went backwards and we mapped the problem in terms of the development challenges, created a vision for outcomes, and then mapped on energy technology to the pathways that enable value creation. And then the implementation process happens. And then, of course, continued tracking through monitoring protocols of the project happens. The third finding is in terms of what capacities and best practices are required for practitioners in terms of mapping social value, in terms of tracing the system and and looking at the bigger picture and understanding their limitations, capacity limitations, and acknowledging the complexity of the projects, and then creating capacity partnerships to address those. And finally, for the policy and financing ecosystem, we identified that the usual ways of finance does not fund scoping study, rather they are more interested in implementing models. They are also weak on funding monitoring and evaluation processes, and it's a burden on the implementers at the end. And finally, the definition of return on investment has to be broadened to include social and local economic development outcomes as well. For policy, it was a recurring theme where the deficits in local administration were passed on to the implementers, whether it's a public, it's a social group, it's a profit-making enterprise or nonprofit. It usually passes on the administrative burden to them. And finally, we identified that community engagement platforms are one of the key enablers of welfare investments, not just energy in other areas. And as a policy measure, they should be encouraged. So theme 3 results in the translation mechanism now being supplemented by implementation guidelines for ensuring that theoretical concepts are not artifacts of my imagination, but can be put to use in practice with measurable and tractable outcomes. So, and based on what I have learned over the course of my research, I would contend that the research and practice of creating access to clean and affordable energy will be better positioned to help achieve the Sustainable Development Agenda 2030 and requires a shift in current paradigms of energy poverty and energy access to a paradigm of energy thriving. Now, at the risk of adding to the crowded field of semantics around energy, I propose energy thriving as a paradigm where the rationale for creating access to clean and affordable energy is to generate social value through energy systems that are deliberately co-produced to be sustainable and not only remedy human well-being deficits, but create conditions for progressively discovering higher forms of well-being. The energy system has been very good at catering to and help retain the socioeconomic hierarchy and control for the past 100 years or so. And I don't think many of us are prepared to wait another 100 years for the carbon-free energy system to take its own sweet time to undo the injustices of the past and dictate the kind of futures available to a large portion of the population. So, in terms of the contribution of the research that I expect to happen to the field of energy and sustainable development, the energy poverty nexus and the ecosystem approach presents a convergent and multidimensional conceptual framework for understanding a variety of phenomena. The social value of energy maps offers a layered and co-evolving set of methods of investigation. And the contextual knowledge-based intervention design and best practices identified tailor to the aspirational futures-oriented data processes. And you see, it's no more a black box. There are ways to identify the translation mechanisms of energy to a variety of human development conditions. But this is not a done deal yet. I intend to continue working on it in terms of expanding the social value of energy concept to identify different variable classes, also working to understand the energy poverty landscape shifts and dynamics, and continue to enhance and adapt the uptake of the ecosystem approach of energy with the partnerships with different kinds of practitioners through action, reflection, collaboration. Before I close, I have a long list of people to thank, so please bear with me. I'll begin with my committee for many things. I'm thankful to them for many things, but I'll particularly point out three. First, for what I have learned from their own research, and that has enabled me to draw from and build upon the knowledge that they have created. To Marco, for the difficult questions that he asks and the questions that keep me grounded. To Arnim for the ideas and several hours of discussion behind the development of the collective action project in Brazil. Of course, Clark, primarily for his enthusiasm. 5 years ago when I went to his office and said, here's a crazy idea, Clark, would you want to be my advisor? 2 years later, he says that here is a crazier idea, let's organize a conference and find more people to jump on the bandwagon. And did we find them? So the Eradicating Poverty Through Energy Innovation Initiative, the Grassroots Energy Innovation Lab, has now completed or has active research projects in 8 countries in 4 continents. I have to say that there has never been a dull moment in my PhD journey. And finally, to all 3 of them together for believing in engaged research that is relevant and of use to society. My PhD journey has entailed building a global researcher practitioner network and multiple co-design projects on the ground. So in addition to the 100,000 plus air miles and an appreciation for good coffee, I appreciate the support from all 3 of you. I'll always be indebted to my family in India for their unqualified support, especially my mother, who I hope now believes that I was up to something useful. To Bridget for being my harshest critic and my best friend throughout these 5 years. To all those who funded and facilitated the research projects and the partners who have collaborated with open hearts and minds, thank you all. So Ricky is here, Muhammad, to both of you. To people at School of Sustainability and SFIS for financially supporting me, to both schools, and to Nalini, Netra, Mary Jane, Fahim for always cheering me on. And of course, I cannot forget my colleagues at the Grassroots Energy Innovation Lab. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Saurabh. That was great. We now have about 20 minutes for question and answer from the audience. So I suggest that there is a hand raising feature in Zoom if you want to try to use it. Otherwise, I think just when one question and answer are done, step in with your own, especially if it's particularly relevant. Oh, I see several. Oh no, I see claps going up, so that's good. People are clapping for you. Excellent. So anyways, I'll open the floor, and Saurabh, I will let you field your own questions.
Right.
Hey, Saurabh, this is Ricky. I had a question regarding the social value of energy paradigm.
Uh-huh.
Do you think there are aspects of it that can be applied to larger industrial scale energy projects?
It's interesting that you asked that question, Ricky, because that's what we are doing right now. We are helping the government of Sierra Leone take this framework and apply it to their energy transition plan for the country for the next several years. And we are looking at the different levels of infrastructure and economic patterns in the country and expanding the concept to be applicable to those. So my dissertation has worked with the empirical data set that has gone into informing this has predominantly been small community projects, but it also has created that set, that basis where we're taking it to the next level and expanding it to as a toolkit for planning energy transitions in much larger scales.
I raised my hand. Can I ask a question? This is Nalini.
Yes, Nalini, please.
Okay. Two quick questions. One, if the energy thriving, could you? Ethra and I are listening, so there's echo. Hold on. Okay. So if energy thriving is one of the framing that you're proposing that incorporates justice and environmental sustainable solutions, how do you see that in the context of basically incorporating both the social value of energy as well as scaling that into on a wider scale? Because I see these as contradictory ideas. So at the global level, this goes back to what Prakriti just said about using in the industrial framing too. And the second one is largely related to your future work, which is how difficult is it to translate, using your concept, translate social value of energy into so that policymakers are much more aware of how and therefore can adjust their way of thinking of using social value of energy and bringing it to the front line in terms of policymaking.
Right, thank you, Nalini. So, beginning with your first question, energy thriving is proposing a paradigm shift from the characterization of the problem, or rather the reduction of the problem to energy poverty. It is unidimensional and unidirectional measures, and the practice of energy access that follows from it, which is about creating certain levels of electron consumption or creating access to devices. What energy thriving as a sensitizing concept or a paradigm is trying to establish is the multidimensionality of the challenge. And this is purely catering to the sustainable development agenda. So the qualifier here is that if energy systems, implementation of energy systems are intended to alleviate poverty and lead to the sustainable development goals, then you cannot look at it from a singular dimension. That's the purpose of proposing the energy thriving paradigm. But then it goes into detail on each of the aspects of the thriving paradigm, whether it's sustainable solutions or so begins with discovering social value of energy, creating sustainable solutions, and it inherently at the intersection of these two concepts, it addresses the question of energy justice. There is a questionnaire that accompanies the framing of energy thriving, which creates a guideline, and then on the implementation aspect, there are the toolkits that has been developed from that. Now, from an industrial framing, I do not fully understand what you mean by an industrial framing, because what we see energy system development happening are through national policy or the market paradigm. And the market paradigm of energy, especially renewable energy, is like a
Market paradigm.
the thin sliver of investment that's going into less than 10% of the global investment for the last 5 years has come from the private sector. And one of the primary reasons is that the private sector has been highly focused on profiting, on creating profit, and that's a challenge that exists. Now, to your second question in terms of informing policy, so that's really a great question. Some of it was answered from the 4-country project we did, which evoked specific policy recommendations in those particular countries, and some generalized observations that the themes that were reoccurring across all the 4 countries. So I think as we go ahead and implement this in different places, there would be new policy recommendations that would come up. Like, for example, in Sierra Leone, the problem of energy theft has come up, is emerging as not a behavioral challenge that the utility sector makes it out to be, but it's more of an infrastructure and the governance challenge that is emerging. So those are the kinds of insights I hope would emerge as we continue applying this concept.
Thank you.
Thank you. I guess there were a few more questions.
Saurabh, I have one question. I think I have my hand raised. You spoke about enabling conditions, and from international development perspective, you're one scholar that has had 2 rotations in Brazil. Stakeholder is critical, especially local stakeholders. What does it take to be able to produce the results that you have produced in gaining more trust from the stakeholders? How do we encourage our scholars to strive for what you have done, and how, more importantly, how do we gain the trust with the stakeholders from the ground level?
Well, thank you, Mohammed, for the question. And I think it's at some point it's difficult, but at certain points it takes it requires one to come out of their constructed thinking about themselves. So, you know, there are 2 things that once Arnim recollected way early, that one of his students, while working in the community, spend a couple of the first few weeks playing table tennis or ping pong with people. You know, that builds relationship. Clark once said that if you have to work with farmers, you should know how to repair fences with them. So that's the, you know, with the place where you start socializing and integrating yourself in the community. It's also pretentious to believe that you will one day become part of them. You will never. You are a cultural outsider, so you'll have to be aware of that. But you have to build those bridges. And what in my case has worked is that I have tried to connect with people on different levels, not purely on work, and we have established the intent of working together first up. This is my intent, and this is and clear communication as to why I am here. I try not to have a secondary agenda that I do not communicate to people, and I feel that has worked in that sense. Another question, perhaps? I saw another hand being raised. Please go ahead and unmute your microphone. I can't see who's raising their hand in my window, sorry. No.
Oh. Hello, do you hear me?
Yeah.
Saurabh, hey, great presentation. I just have a question about the community engagement platform that you talked about. You mentioned that you identify it as a good way to achieve good outcomes. Could you speak a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, sure. So this was one of the initial findings in my project in Brazil, that one of the key enablers or barriers in the first place was the lack of a platform that that was inclusive, that let people present their views and had people question. So from there, one of the key interventions that is still continuing is to improve the transparency of the residents association of the community by communicating better using social media and other sources. So from there to all the projects that I have worked on or analyzed, it appears that because development projects, especially energy projects, cannot be a one-time thing. You cannot have a technology intervention and let that hope that it would constantly create value. There has to be that thought going on behind it, how to create more forms of value, how to build on this. In Uganda, there is this phenomenal rural structure called the Village Loans and Savings Associations, usually led by women of the community, where they take small contributions from people, invest that in a bank, and whatever interest they get, they return it to the community after the end of the year. These platforms, when our partners went in and created clean energy retail businesses, these platforms were information sources for people in the community. These platforms were negotiating platforms for terms with the service provider, and they also were places where people came in and identified different opportunities. So, like, for example, I have a solar light now, what can I do next with it? Someone comes in and says, hey, I saw someone raising chickens, so why don't we do and increase our incomes there? So this is one of the key strengths of the rural countryside in Uganda, lacking most forms of financial support and financial support nets that you would think that exist, but it does not, especially in Western Uganda. This is one of the key social structure that sustains, economically sustains the communities there. Similarly, in the Philippines, people have created emergency funds using revenues from this, and then the oversight function is allocated to the elders in the community. So these platforms are extremely important and one of the key enablers of value creation and value discovery. So does that get to your question?
Yeah, thank you.
I have my hand raised, Saurabh. Should I go ahead?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank you so much, Saurabh. It's just, you must be relieved in some extent, and also maybe wondering what kind of additional job Marco and the rest of the others are going to add you. But let me ask you, based on your experience of the Philippines, India, Brazil, and Nepal, and if you then have to talk about the barriers that barriers to driving social value, what they would be. What do you think are the barriers that will emerge in driving the social value of energy? And then connected to that, what are the opportunities that you saw at the local level that will then help create a condition that enable them to have a social value of energy, or advance the condition for social value of energy?
Mm-hmm. So there are several, thank you for the question, Ezra. So there are multiple such barriers that I observe in different, and it ties in really closely to the kind of governance and organizational structures of the projects. You know, a majority of the project energy intervention projects in the developing world are aid-based projects where a company is contracted by a certain foundation or a certain development agency to go and implement a model. They are more interested in implementing models. And for example, in one of the projects in Nepal, the Asian Development Bank had a really comprehensive and elaborate governance structure requirement from project implementers that included like a committee of 12 people, voting rights and all that. But, and this was in 2015, less than 3 years of the project, and this was starting to burden people because they had no experience with organizing at the local level and what is quorum, what is voting rights, and how do majority work. And you know, the usual story of the upper caste people controlling the entire operations was replayed over again. Then there are community owned and operated projects which suffer from the technology paradigm. It's like there is very little understanding or engagement in terms of how energy technology can integrate. It's basic lighting and a couple of fans that people usually want, and then it like from there it does not take into account the economic capability development. So in many places, people say that if the cost of energy goes up marginally, whether it's a mini grid or like a solar charging for rent operation, people are willing to go back to kerosene lamps if the price of energy goes up by 15–20%. So those are some of the barriers in the different models of implementations, and I would contend that this comes down from the energy access, energy poverty paradigm, which fixes that minimum, that it has like ingrained so deeply the idea of basic service and basic consumption that it is arresting imagination at multiple levels. So I think the principal opportunity there is to create, rethink what the role of energy in personal and communal life, not put energy center stage and not make that the purpose of living. Yours and my relationship with electricity is the power outlet on the wall. Why would we expect the energy system to take center stage in people's lives when it goes to the rural or marginalized communities? The best form of energy when it has receded to the background and it enables multiple functions. So it's unfair to imagine that the energy system should take center stage in people's lives when it is implemented. So that's the principal area of reimagination and rethinking in how energy implementation is done.
That's good. Thank you, Saurabh. Good.
Hi, Saurabh. I have a question.
Yes.
Great presentation. I would just like to ask, since you mentioned the SDGs a lot, and the UN is very active in the field of energy poverty, in the energy and poverty nexus, and alleviating poverty in development work. I have like 3 questions or food for thoughts. The first one is, do you think you could connect your research or like your future work with the work that the UN does to evaluate projects and make decisions about where to use funding? And then the second one is, how about other funding bodies like the World Bank or the Global Environment Facilities? Do you see your work in influencing any of these agencies? And then the last one is, do you think after 2030 there will, or even before that, there would probably be new development goals? Do you see your work as contributing to any of those? I know it seems like a little big, but I know you also want to be ambitious and win like a Nobel Prize. So I'm just wondering.
Thank you, Bridget. Yeah, I know the question you ask are relevant to the work that you do in the Philippines. And these are questions that you have to spend how many $1 million, like $75 million in electrification, and you guys don't know where to spend it. So yes, I hope that this work influences some of the work, because I do not doubt the intentions of the UN in creating energy systems that are creating value and development, meeting the agenda. What I do believe is that there is a tendency to adopt simple measures and simple mechanisms that are easy to follow, that are generalizable, and it communicates well to people. And I think the problem here is oversimplification of a problem. So I definitely hope that as this work progresses with implementation in Sierra Leone, which is underway, and in other places, it does create a body of evidence that multidimensional and interlinked concepts do work as well, as well as simple economic approaches do. And managing qualitative data is not as difficult, and it's not as intractable as it may seem. So I do not know the answer to that, but I do hope that the project in Sierra Leone establishes at least the initial body of evidence to that. And beyond 2030 is a great question, because this morning the SE4All released the tracking SDG 7 report for 2030. So they are not going to meet the 2030 goals, at least for SDG 7 by a long shot. 2019 said that the 100% universal electrification is going to fall short by 7%-ish. The 2020 projections make it like around 13%. So it's not going to happen. And especially with the COVID situation now, there is the risk of a lot of funding being diverted from SDG investments to relief packages. Now, how that money is spent, whether it's in line with sustainable development goals or not, that's a question yet to be seen. So I do not know the answer for that, but I'm quite certain that there is an opportunity for rethinking SDG even before 2030.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I want to say thank you to everyone, and to Saurabh especially. For those of us who are left, if you could briefly unmute your microphones and give Saurabh a nice round of applause. I know that he would appreciate getting the positive feedback.
Thank you everyone.
Thank you for the questions, and and for being here for the defense. And I know once we're all eventually back together, we will have an opportunity to celebrate collectively the success of Saurabh's project. So, but with that, the defense will move into executive session. If I could ask those